Hi, it's Pastor Andy with our Tuesday video this week. And our world today has developed some different understandings of what freedom means. And a great deal of that understanding relates to personal or self-autonomy. But we really, as I mentioned on Sunday, we really don't have a lot of autonomy. Paul says in Romans 6:15 through 23, and specifically in verse 16, that we really don't have much. We are a slave to someone, whether that someone or something is sin or God, and therefore righteousness. But to understand the idea of freedom better, we must really get a better grip of what slavery was in the first century. Now, admittedly, I'm going to give you about a 2-minute overview here, and there's no way for that to suffice. But let me do what I can. Now, again, slavery is an atrocity. I absolutely, owning another person is not a part of the design of God. However, not all slaves are the same, and I'm going to point that out to you in just a moment, and not all masters are the same. And that was particularly true in first century Rome. Now, granted, there were masters that were very similar to some of the thoughts that are probably going through your mind of early 19th century America, 18th century America, Africa, for centuries before that, etc., where there are abusive masters taking advantage of their slaves. Absolutely, that happened. There were slave revolts in the first century BC in Rome, led by Spartacus. There's a movie about that generally. First century AD, there were revolts. However, there were people who chose to be slaves back at that time. And there were two reasons that people would do this. Number one is choosing to be a slave might keep them from financial ruin. Perhaps they owed a lot of debts, and they were going to go to debtor's prison. Now, the problem with debtor's prison is you don't get out of prison until you paid off your debts. But how do you pay off your debts if you're not able to do everything that you need to do because you're in debtor's prison? So some people would choose to be a slave in order to have some means of income, some means of care, even their food and stuff, so that they would have an opportunity not to face financial ruin. A second reason was people chose it to learn a skill or a trade. Some people chose to be a slave for a period of time, offering their service so that they could learn how to do something to make their life better, maybe in the present, but certainly in the future. So those are two absolutely, especially the latter one, a completely different idea of slavery. It's almost like we would say an entry-level job in our world. And certainly there are companies and organizations that treat their employees better and worse than others, which would have been true in Rome as well. So with that understanding that some people would willingly serve as a slave, give themselves over to someone as a slave, some research has showed that as much as 85 to 90% of all people in Rome and potentially throughout the Roman Empire were either slaves or had been slaves at some point in their life. So freedom, as we look at this, is a term that Paul is using to help his audience who completely understand slavery and understand it much differently than we do in 20th and now 21st century America, to help them to understand freedom. It is freedom that they either understood because they had received freedom or that they desired freedom, but it was very different. Now, Paul is not stating that freedom in Christ means to be free from masters and lords. He does not say that at all. If that was true, then they would only be under the law of Christ, which he mentions in Galatians 6, for instance. But it is not what he says, because he still talks to those who are serving, like in Ephesians chapter 6 or Colossians chapter 3, serving under masters. And yet there are other times, like with Onesimus in the book of Philemon, where he appeals for the release of a slave. Now, we're working through Romans, but as we do that, if we're going to understand freedom a little bit better, we must also understand the trappings of sin. This is what Paul has been focused on, sin, for 5.5 chapters now. And really in the last 2 chapters, he's really shown the distinction between the sin and the sin of Adam versus the grace of God and the person of Jesus Christ. In John chapter 8, Jesus is speaking to a group of Jews, and he tells them that they will, quote, die in your sin, unquote. He gives them a choice to believe, and some of them did. To the group who believed, Jesus told them that if they abided in His Word, they are truly His disciples, and they would know the truth, and the truth would set them free. Verse 21, you can see this in John 8, verses 21 through 36. In verse 34, Jesus said that everyone who commits a sin, notice Jesus' words here, everyone who commits a sin is a slave to sin, before then stating in verse 36 that if the Son therefore should set you free, you shall be free indeed. Paul is sharing this exact same message. And the message is ultimately that if you have been freed from your sin, you have freedom, but the freedom is not for your sake. It is not that you have autonomy for yourself. It is that you have freedom for God. It is not about personal autonomy. It is freedom from bondage, freedom to now do what is good. Now, if we connect the idea in these verses of Paul, 15 through 23, and we go back to chapter 6, verse 14, where grace brings freedom from the law, then we can see that God has not set us free from the law and from sin to be free from God, but rather He has freed us from sin in order to be free for God. Being free for God means our allegiance is now with Him. It is freedom to be righteous. It is freedom to become holy. That is God's goal for us, so that should be our goal for Him and also for us. And I'll speak more about that idea in tomorrow's video.